99% get meditation wrong. The Buddha said you must talk to yourself. As you focus on the present moment, remember that you're not simply watching what's happening. You're playing a role in making it happen. The Buddha talks about 3 kinds of fabrication, and we're engaged in all 3 as we put the present moment together. There's bodily fabrication, the I and out breath. Verbal fabrication, directed thought and evaluation, how you talk to yourself, focusing on a topic, making comments, asking questions. And then mental fabrication, your perceptions and feelings. As John Lee would point out, the verbal fabrications are real troublemakers. The way we talk to ourselves can create a lot of problems in the present moment, depending on the kind of commentary we're making. So, an important part of meditation is learning to talk to yourself in a new way. This, of course, builds on the principles of right speech. Think about the Buddha's recommendations for how he would gauge his speech. 1, it had to be true. 2, it had to be beneficial. And 3, it had to be the right time and right place to be harsh, the right time and right place to be gentle. 3 tests for his speech to pass. That's more than a lot of us apply to our own speech. Usually for us, a thought occurs to the mind and it comes right out the mouth. We don't have a vow of silence around the monastery here. A lot of people take that as free license to speak whatever they want to speak about. But you should regard it as an opportunity to practice right speech. When you open your mouth to talk, ask yourself, what is your motive? Is it really going to be beneficial for the listeners? Or is it just showing off your knowledge? Or showing off your opinions? If you really think about your speech before you say it, you find that it becomes a lot more effective and that it gets a lot easier to speak to yourself in the right way as you sit down to meditate. As you're focusing on the breath, you want your speech to be true. You really are making true comments about how the breath is going, where it's comfortable, where it's not. And you want your comments to be beneficial. You're trying to get the mind to settle down. Any speech beyond that is not really necessary. We're trying to speak in ways that lead the mind to a place where it doesn't have to speak. As for whether you're going to be gentle or harsh with yourself as you speak, that depends on how you read your own mind. How well you respond to harsh speech, how well you respond to gentle speech. This is something you have to pay attention to. When the Buddha talks about directed thought and evaluation as factors of the first jhana, they're not just an unfortunate wobbling in the mind that can't settle down yet. You're using your inner speech to get things comfortable inside, to get the mind to be happy to be with its object by adjusting the object. Adjusting the mind. Adjusting the object means adjusting the breath to be long or short, fast or slow, heavy, light, deep, shallow. Where you're going to focus. Which part of the breath you're going to be most sensitive to. Then you talk to yourself about how to allow that comfortable breath to spread through the body. You can't force it. If you force it, it turns uncomfortable. You have to think of it flowing smoothly and easily. This is where some mental fabrication comes in as you work with the perceptions you have of how the breath flows. You see which ways of perceiving the breath, which ways of picturing the breath to yourself gives good results. That's adjusting the object. Adjusting the mind means asking yourself, what is your attitude toward the meditation right now? What moods are you bringing in from the day? If need be, you try to counteract them. Here again, You use directed thought and evaluation. If you're irritated about something that happened during the day, well, how can you talk to yourself in a way that allows you to put the irritation down? If you're irritated about people around you, how can you think in ways that remind you that you're with a group of people who want to meditate? They may not be the best people in the world. They may not be ideal companions, but their values are in line with yours. They value the practice of meditation. It's good to be with people like this. Learning how to talk to yourself as an important part of the meditation. We think that meditation often is about not thinking, and there will be stages where thinking is really minimal. All you need is just a perception to hold you in place. But to get there, you have to think in the right way, because we bring narratives in from the day. We bring attitudes in from the day. They may be helpful, they may be not. If they're not helpful, you have to counteract them. The Ajahns in Thailand often talk about surveying your mind as you sit down to meditate. Is it leaning to the future? Is it leaning to the past? Is it leaning toward things that you like, to things you don't like? What can you do so that it doesn't lean, so that it's sitting straight up? You may have to make a survey like this for the mind to be willing to settle down. Remember, you have a whole committee in there, so you have talked to them to convince them that this is a good place to stay. You can do part of that by making the breath comfortable, but that's not going to be enough. You have to keep reminding yourself of why it's important to train the mind. We all look for happiness, and yet we're causing suffering by our actions. We want to know why. There's some ignorance there. You have to get the mind still so that you can see where its ignorance is. As the Buddha pointed out, the suffering of the mind is not just a feeling of pain, it's the clinging. It's something you do, and you cling because you like certain things. So we're suffering because of our likes, which means you have to examine them. That requires that the mind be stable and still in the present moment with a sense of well-being, so that it's able to step back and examine these things objectively. We like our lust, we like our anger, we like our delusion, all our opinions about things that have nothing to do with putting an end to suffering. A lot of that the Buddha would class as ignorance, a thicket of views. Yet we like our thicket of views, so you have to examine why. And sometimes the why is not as obvious as you might think. The Buddha talks about pinpointing where your craving is focused. You might say that you crave another person, but do you actually crave the other person? Or do you crave a perception about the other person, or some ways you have of thinking about the other person, or other associations that have nothing to do with the person, or only a tangential connection with the person? If you're angry about something, are you really angry about that? Or is it related to something else that you're actually more angry about? Or do you simply enjoy being angry? There's a certain rush that comes with anger, a sense of power. If you've been feeling hemmed in and powerless, this gives you an opportunity to exercise a little power. At least that's what the mind says. Your sense of shame, your sense of compunction gets thrown out the window. And a lot of things you would ordinarily not do when you're in your right mind all of a sudden seem fair play, fair game. So when we say that we like being angry, exactly what is it about the anger that you find attractive? You've got to look into that. It may not always be the same thing every time you're angry. I was teaching in Portland last week. One of the questions that came up was, Is it enough to just deal with anger as a general phenomenon, or do you have to get to the specifics? If you don't get to the specifics, you don't see exactly where your craving is located. And the specifics are there. What's the allure? What are the drawbacks? How can you develop a sense of dispassion for the specifics? Because the specifics are where the craving is focused, and dispassion is what we're aiming for. For a lot of us, the word dispassion doesn't sound all that appealing, but think of it simply as growing up. You had some childish games that you liked to play, and then you realize there's not much there, and you're better off just not getting involved in the games. Well, lust is a kind of game. It's a childish game. Anger is a childish game. All our delusions are childish games. When you can see them that way, then you can see that dispassion is actually something positive. The Buddha always relates dispassion to escape, freedom, being unfettered. We tie ourselves down to things that we like, and then we complain because we're constrained. But then we don't like the idea of leaving those things. The mind is fighting itself. So the mind needs to get still to figure these things out. This is why we think in new ways, breathe in new ways, talk to ourselves in new ways, to get things to settle down. Sometimes it's easy. You sit down, the world seems to go away, and you're right here. Other times it requires a lot of talking to yourself. Don't measure your meditation by how quiet it is, because sometimes some really important things require that you talk to yourself well. Talk to yourself thoroughly. Turn over a lot of stones. Turn over a lot of things to see what's underneath. But if you're heading toward an understanding, and it's the kind of understanding that frees you from the things that you use to tie yourself down, then it's all to the good. So even though, as Ajahn Lee says, our habit of talking to ourselves can be a big problem, it's also part of the solution. Think of your use of language as a skill that you have to master, and it's not just being able to talk a lot. As the Buddha says, the ability to talk a lot doesn't mean you're wise. But if you can learn to talk to yourself in ways that are true and beneficial and timely, you take this troublemaker and turn it into part of the path. Fabrication. The mind has a basic habit, which is to create things. In fact, when the Buddha describes causality, how experiences come about, he says that the power of creation, or sankhara, the mental tendency to put things together, actually comes prior to our sensory experience. It's because the mind is actively putting things together, that it knows things. The problem is that most of its actions, most of its creations, come out of ignorance, so the kind of knowledge that comes from those creations can be misleading. For this reason, what you want to do in the process of meditation is to back up, to get down as close to this process of creation as you can, to see if there's a way to do it skillfully, that leads to knowledge, that leads you to a point that breaks through ignorance. And that means, instead of building up a lot of things, you let things fall apart so you can get down to exactly where these basic forces in the mind are putting things together. Now, it so happens that when we bring the mind to the breath, we have all these basic forces right here in their most elemental forms. The breath is the factor that fashions the body. It's what they call kaya sankhara, or the physical putting together. The breath is what puts life together in the body. If it weren't for the breath here, things would start falling apart really fast. Then there's verbal fabrication, vachi sankhara, the act of putting things in words. The two basic verbal sankharas are directed thought and evaluation, and you've got those right here too. You direct your thoughts to the breath and then evaluate the breath. How does the breath feel? Does it feel good? If it does, stay with it. If it doesn't feel good, you can change it. This is about the most basic level of conversation you can have with yourself. Does this feel good or not? Comfortable or not? Yes. No. And then you work with that. What are you working with? You're working with mental fabrication, citta sankhara, which covers feeling and perception, feelings of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. And then perceptions are the labels the mind gives to things. This is pleasant. This is painful. This is this and that is that. When you've got the mind with the breath, you've got all of these things brought together. The feelings that come with the breath, the perceptions that label the breath. Now the breath is coming in. Now the breath is going out. Now the mind is like this. Now it's like that. The directed thought and the evaluation are there as well, keeping you focused on the breath and on evaluating the breath. So these things are all together. If you stray away from here, you're usually straying away into distraction, into the realm of further elaboration, in which you lose this basic frame of reference and create a whole other one. It's what they call becoming in the texts, when you create other worlds in the mind. Once you get into those other worlds, you lose touch with the process of creation. You lose touch with how becoming is brought together. So you've got to learn how to take those worlds of distraction and the processes that form them apart. The Buddha talks about various ways of dealing with distraction. Once you've realized you've left your original frame of reference, you bring yourself back. In other words, you remind yourself. In some cases, the simple act of reminding is enough to disperse that other little world you've created for yourself and come back to this one. Other times, you have to reflect actively on the drawbacks of that other world, of the thinking that creates it, especially if it's thinking imbued with lust, aversion, delusion, or harmfulness. You've got to remind yourself, what would happen if I thought about this for a while? Well, you'd create certain habits in the mind, and once those habits are embedded in the mind, they lead to actions that can create all kinds of problems. When you see the drawbacks of that kind of thinking, you say, I don't need that. I've had enough of that in my life. You drop it and come back to the breath. Other times, you can consciously ignore the distraction. A little world appears in your mind and you say, I don't want to enter into that. But for some reason, it just doesn't go away. You realize the reason it's not going away is because you're paying attention to it. Even if you don't like it, paying attention to it is enough to keep it going. Like a tar trap. You touch the tar with your hand and you get stuck. You try to pull yourself loose from the tar with the other hand and you get both hands stuck. Pull yourself off with your foot. Your foot gets stuck. Bite the tar, your mouth gets stuck. So the only way to deal with it is to not touch it. In other words, don't pay attention to it. You know it's there, but you just don't give it any mind. After a while, from lack of attention, it'll die away. A fourth way of pulling yourself back is to notice that when there's this process of creation, when there are these little worlds you create in your mind, an element of tension goes with them. Things would be a lot easier if you didn't create these worlds. If you just relax whatever physical and mental tension supports these things. So look for the tension. Once you can locate it, just relax it. When you relax the tension, the thought goes away. A fifth way, when none of these other methods work, is to tell yourself, okay, I'm going to clench my teeth, press my tongue against the palate, and I will not think about that other thing. In other words, just through the force of your will, you force it out of your mind. This is the method of last resort, the one that's the least precise and works only as long as your willpower lasts. But sometimes it's the only thing that will clear the air. If we were to compare these various methods to tools, this would be the sledgehammer. It may be crude, but you need one in your arsenal for cases when scalpels and X-Acto knives can't handle the job. So when one of these other little worlds gets created in your mind, you use whichever of these methods work to let go of it and bring yourself back to the most basic levels of the process of creation: the breath, directed thought, evaluation, feelings, perceptions. Stay right on this level. What do you do with them on this level? Well, you can create levels of concentration in the mind. Concentration is a kind of creation, but it's a creation that instead of obscuring the process of what's going on in the mind, actually makes it clearer. You create, but without leaving these basic levels of your frame of reference. In other words, you put them to use in a new way. You put feelings to use in a new way. You learn how to create a feeling of pleasure from the breath, so that the pleasure gets more and more intense, more and more solid. Just the act of sitting here breathing gets really refreshing. And if you stay with the feeling as a feeling, in and of itself, it doesn't pull you off into other mental worlds. You stay right here. It feels good right here. So instead of feeding on the pleasure in an aimless way, you do it in a systematic way. That way you can keep the mind with a sense of pleasure, a sense of rapture, and it doesn't wander off. That's what the concentration is all about. As it strengthens the mind, it gives direction to the mind. It takes the desire for pleasure and puts it to good use. Once the mind feels comfortable in the present moment, it's not going to wander off anyplace else. It feels good right here. A lot more satisfaction comes from the sense of ease right here than from the little bits and pieces of satisfaction coming from the other worlds you can create with your mind. Again, this is a process of creation, but it's a lot more skillful than normal. It keeps things on a basic level where you're in touch with the process. You don't lose sight of it. It's like the difference between sitting out in an audience watching a play and being behind the stage. Behind the stage, you see the actual play, but you also see what goes on behind it. In that way, you're a lot less likely to get carried away by the illusion of the play. Now, of course, pain is going to come into your meditation as well. Sometimes it's out-and-out pain. Other times it's more subtle. And again, as with the pleasure, instead of thinking that you're on the receiving end of the pain, a victim of the pain, you start putting it to use. The pain is there for you to comprehend. That's what the Buddha said in his teachings on the Four Noble Truths. The task with regard to pain is to comprehend it. Once the mind is solid enough and stable enough so as not to feel threatened by the pain, it can analyze the pain on whatever level it may be searing pain, or more subtle stress. As you comprehend the pain, you start finding that you understand the mind a lot better too. All the little animals in the mind that tend to gather around pain. You begin to notice who they are, what they are, and you realize, that's not me. It's just these thoughts that tend to cluster around pain. If you want to identify with them, you can, but they're going to turn your mind into a menagerie. They're going to create a lot of turmoil, and so you learn how to let them go. Even when you're focused on the pleasant levels of concentration, you'll find that as you get more and more sensitive toward these various levels, a subtle element of stress accompanies each one of them. Once you identify where that stress is, you let it go. That takes you to a more subtle level of concentration. You stay there for a while. In the beginning, you don't notice the stress in the new level. It's like going into a bright room where your eyes haven't yet adjusted to the light. At first, you see nothing but the dazzle. But if you stay there for long enough, your eyes begin to adjust and you begin to notice, oh, there are shapes, there are forms, there are things in this room that you can see. It's the same as you go from one level of concentration to the next. Take the stress of directed thought and evaluation, for instance. Once the breath really feels full, really feels satisfying, you don't need to keep evaluating it. You don't have to keep reminding yourself to stay with it. You're just there with a basic perception. You let go of the directed thought and evaluation, and bong, you come down to a much deeper level. You go through this step by step. You realize what an important role perceptions play in this, the labels you put on things. You're constantly labeling the breath. When the breath is still, so that you can drop that label, you begin to label the sense of space that's left, then the sense of knowing that's left as you drop the label for space, then all the way up to the sphere of nothingness. That's still called a perception attainment. It's based on the label that the mind puts on the experience that keeps you there. So again, you're with these very basic levels of creation in the mind. When you start taking them apart, that's when things really get interesting. Instead of building up, you're letting go, bit by bit. And then, of course, you're getting attached to the new level you reach. But it's a good attachment. Otherwise, you'd go floating off to other worlds. This attachment here, at least, keeps you in the present moment, where things can begin to open up. And instead of elaborating on it, you keep applying the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and keep the questions basic. Where is the stress here? This is especially important when you get to the level of infinitude of consciousness, or the infinitude of space. On those levels, it's easy to develop a sense that you've reached the ground of being, from which all things come and to which all things return. If you're not careful, you can really start philosophizing on this theme, elaborating on it, getting into all kinds of abstractions about the relationship between the absolute and the relative, emanation. All sorts of big buzzword issues, but they're totally irrelevant to the real problem in the mind, that there's still stress here. If you're still stuck here, you haven't gone beyond. You haven't reached the deathless. You've got to keep asking that same old basic question. Where is there stress here? Look for it. See what you're doing that keeps the stress going. See that it's unnecessary, and then let go. Ultimately, you open up to something totally unfabricated. So instead of building things up that pull you away from the present, you start by building up states of concentration in the mind. These are types of fabrication, of course, but they're the type of fabrication that keeps you within this frame of reference, the very absolute present. They don't distract you into other levels where you lose touch with the basic building blocks in the process of fabrication. This is a basic pattern throughout the Buddha's teachings. Before you let go of things, you first have to learn to do them skillfully, mindfully, with awareness. The doing, the mastering of the skill, is what enables you to know them. This brings us back to that basic principle we talked about earlier. We wouldn't know anything. There would be no awareness at all if there weren't any doing in the mind. You have to learn how to do things more and more skillfully until finally you can get to a level where the mind becomes too sensitive to do anything, and at that point, it opens up to a totally different kind of awareness. So you make use of what you've got. The Buddha noticed that all things fabricated have an element of stress. But what are you going to do? How are you going to get to the unfabricated? You can't use the unfabricated as a tool because that would be fabricating it, and that's not its nature. You learn how to use the process of fabrication in a more skillful way. You divide things up into the 4 noble truths. There's stress, the origination of stress, the cessation of stress, and the path. The path is a process of taking things that are stressful, these perceptions, these feelings, these processes of creation, and using them in a skillful way. So you use fabrication to undo fabrication, and then finally reach a point where everything opens up to the unfabricated. It's an extremely skillful path, a skillful approach. It takes the raw materials that we've got around us all the time, the activities that we ordinarily use to create experience, and teaches us how to use them in a more skillful way, getting down to basics, keeping away from abstractions. Once there's an abstraction in the mind, there's a new level of being in there, a new frame of reference. It pulls you away from the present. A lot of self-delusion comes through abstraction. A lot of opportunity for lying to yourself comes through abstraction. So we keep things basic. We keep our nose to the ground. Just look at the basic things we have: physical, verbal, and mental fabrication. Learn how to put them to the proper use. Use them more and more skillfully. Get more and more in touch with the actual process of fabrication right here in the present moment. That's where things open up.